Have you ever noticed how some people seem to navigate life with unsettling clarity, while most of us stumble through anxieties, doubts, and repetitive patterns we can't even name? There's something deeply disturbing about the way certain individuals can see through the collective illusions that keep the rest of us imprisoned in lives we never consciously chose. They possess something Yuval calls advanced metacognition, the rare ability to observe their own mental processes with the same objectivity they'd use to observe a natural phenomenon. This ability, present in only about 1% of the population, not only radically transforms the individual experience of being alive, but also provokes complex and often hostile reactions from those who still operate under the cognitive automatisms of the majority. When you develop this expanded awareness, when you begin to see through the veils that keep billions of people functioning on autopilot, you not only free yourself from invisible limitations, you also become an involuntary threat to those who still rely on those illusions to make sense of their existence. Human history is filled with examples of individuals who developed this advanced metacognition and paid a steep price for it. Socrates, who challenged the certainties of his peers until they preferred to sentence him to death rather than confront their own ignorance. Galileo, forced to recant his discoveries because they threatened the ordered cosmos that gave psychological security to an entire civilization. Darwin, ostracized for revealing truths about our nature that shattered comforting narratives about our special place in the universe. Each of these thinkers had something beyond simple intelligence or technical knowledge. They had developed the ability to examine their own assumptions, to question the thought structures they themselves had internalized, to simultaneously hold multiple perspectives on reality without dogmatic attachment to any of them. This metacognition is not just an intellectual skill, it's a fundamental reorganization of consciousness that allows one to perceive the patterns by which the human mind constructs, meaning including the patterns of the very mind doing the observing. What makes this capacity so rare and so disturbing to most people is that it reveals something profoundly uncomfortable about the nature of common human experience. Most of us live in a state that neuroscientists call an overactive default mode network, where our consciousness is constantly engaged in automatic narratives about ourselves, projections into the future based on past patterns, and total identification with the contents of our minds. We live as though we are our thoughts, as if our emotions are absolute truths about reality, as if the stories we tell about ourselves are our real, immutable identity. For most people, questioning these automatisms is equivalent to questioning their very existence because they've never learned to distinguish between the observer and the observed, between the consciousness that perceives and the content being perceived. When you develop genuine metacognition, you begin to notice these patterns not just in yourself, but in the entire social structure around you. You see how institutions, traditions, economic systems, and even personal relationships are upheld by tacit agreements about what is real, what matters, what deserves our attention and energy. You realize that many of the existential crises haunting our time, from epidemic anxiety to extreme political polarization, are symptoms of a humanity that has lost the ability to examine its own meaning-making processes. People suffer not because life is inherently suffering, but because they're trapped in thought and perception patterns that generate unnecessary suffering, and they don't even know these patterns exist, let alone that they can be questioned or changed. Modern technology has dramatically intensified this situation in multiple ways simultaneously. On one hand, it has offered unprecedented tools for the development of metacognition. We have access to contemplative traditions from every culture, to neuroscientific discoveries about how the mind works, to practices like mindfulness meditation that have been refined over millennia specifically to develop the ability to observe one's own awareness. On the other hand, the same technology has created an environment of constant distraction and stimulation that makes it even harder for most people to develop the mental stillness needed for self-observation. Social media, designed to capture and monetize our attention, operates by stimulating the automatic patterns of comparison, external validation, and emotional reactivity that metacognition teaches us to recognize and transcend. The result is a humanity increasingly divided between those gaining clarity about their own minds and those becoming more and more trapped in mental patterns they can't even perceive. Harari notes that this divide is creating not just individual differences, but a new form of social stratification based on second-order cognitive capacity. Those who develop metacognition not only have more fulfilling lives and less unnecessary suffering, they also become far more capable of navigating the complex world we're building. They can distinguish between information and knowledge, between stimulus and insight, between emotional reaction and conscious response. More importantly, they develop what we might call cognitive immunity to manipulation, whether political, commercial, or social. When you can observe your own decision-making processes, when you see how your emotions are generated by specific interpretations of experience, when you understand how your beliefs were shaped by cultural and historical conditioning, you become much harder to manipulate by those who rely on others' unconsciousness to maintain power or influence. This ability to see through manipulation, to perceive patterns most people can't, to question assumptions others treat as absolute truths, naturally generates resistance and even hostility, not because these individuals are doing something wrong, but because their very existence acts as an uncomfortable mirror for those still on autopilot. When someone shows it's possible to live with less anxiety, with more clarity, with greater autonomy over one's mental states, it inevitably raises the painful question of why others can't do the same. The answer, of course, is that they can, but doing so would require examining and potentially abandoning thought and behavior patterns that have become central to their identity. The phenomenon intensifies because those who develop metacognition often discover that many of the concerns dominating most people's lives are largely created by how we think about them. Anxiety about the future, for example, is usually the result of projecting past patterns onto imaginary scenarios and then reacting emotionally to those projections as if they were present realities. Relationship suffering often stems from expectations based on stories about how things should be, rather than accepting and responding to what's actually happening. Feelings of personal inadequacy often arise from comparisons to internalized standards absorbed uncritically from culture without ever asking whether those standards make sense for our specific situation. When you develop the ability to see these patterns in action, many forms of suffering simply stop making sense, not because you've become numb, but because you've understood their mechanics and discovered they're optional. But here's the paradox that makes this situation so complex. Although metacognition frees the individual from many unnecessary forms of suffering, it can also generate a genuine sense of isolation and responsibility. When you realize that most human drama is created by mental patterns that could be questioned, when you see loved ones suffering over problems you know are largely self-generated, when you understand that many of the social structures governing us rely on maintaining collective unconsciousness, you're faced with complex moral and practical choices about how to live with this understanding. You can try to help others gain awareness, risking being seen as arrogant or threatening. You can withdraw and focus solely on your own development, risking becoming indifferent to the suffering around you. Or you can try to live in a way where your own clarity serves as an example without trying to impose your discoveries on others. Harari suggests we're at a historical moment where this tension between expanded awareness and cognitive automatism is becoming one of the defining factors of human evolution. Emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence and biotechnology, are creating possibilities both for the elevation of human consciousness and for its more sophisticated manipulation. The capacity to develop metacognition may become not just an individual advantage, but an evolutionary necessity for the survival of human autonomy. On the other hand, these same technologies can be used to create forms of social control based on the precise exploitation of cognitive automatisms that most people have never learned to question. What makes this urgent is that we're quickly approaching a point where the gap between those who've developed metacognition and those still locked in automatic patterns may become irreversible, not necessarily in a biological sense, but in the sense that the social and technological structures we are building may make it increasingly difficult for someone who hasn't developed this capacity to acquire it later. If your attention has been hijacked since childhood by algorithms designed to keep you in constant distraction, if your thought patterns were shaped by information environments meant to trigger specific emotional reactions, if your life choices were influenced by behavioral manipulation operating below the threshold of awareness, then it may become harder and harder to develop the mental stillness and clarity needed to question those patterns. That's why those who possess this rare capacity often feel a conflicted sense of responsibility. They realize their mental clarity is not just a personal privilege, but potentially a tool that could benefit others if those others were willing and able to receive it. At the same time, they understand that trying to force awareness onto someone who is not ready may not only be ineffective, but counterproductive, generating even more resistance and polarization. This is one reason why many contemplative traditions developed gradual and indirect methods for transmitting insight, recognizing that expanded awareness can't simply be explained or transferred. It must be cultivated through personal practice and experience. The hostility that metacognitively aware people often face also has deeper roots in human psychology. Our brains evolved in small groups where conforming to shared norms was a matter of survival. Those who questioned group beliefs and behaviors too much could pose a threat to the social cohesion needed to face external challenges. Even though we now live in much more complex and diverse societies, those ancient instincts still influence our psychology. When someone shows it's possible to think and live in radically different ways from accepted norms, it can trigger primitive alarms about threats to group stability, even when that person isn't trying to impose their discoveries on anyone else. Moreover, there's a psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance that causes people to actively resist information that contradicts their existing beliefs, especially when those beliefs are central to their identity. If someone has built their entire life around certain assumptions about how the world works, about what's possible for a human being, about the natural limitations of the human condition, then encountering someone who has transcended those limitations can be deeply threatening. It's psychologically more comfortable to disqualify that person as arrogant, deluded, or somehow defective than to confront the possibility that you're living far below your potential simply because you haven't questioned limitations that are in fact optional. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly which aspect of this discussion on metacognition and expanded consciousness most sparks your curiosity or resistance. Do you recognize moments in your own experience where you can observe your thought patterns with some distance? I know that often we keep these deeper reflections to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming too introspective or philosophical in everyday conversations. But these questions about how our own minds work are fundamental to how we navigate life. If anything we've discussed resonates with your experience, share it in the comments. I notice my automatic thought patterns when. Your honesty may help others recognize that they are not alone in their journey of self-awareness and may even inspire someone to start paying more attention to the workings of their own consciousness. The deep irony of this situation is that those who develop metacognition rarely sought it to become superior to others or to gain some kind of social advantage. In most cases, they were driven to question their mental patterns by the very suffering those patterns created. They discovered the ability to observe their own minds not through intellectual ambition, but as an existential necessity to escape cycles of anxiety, depression, or simply a persistent sense that they were living inauthentically. The development of this ability often comes with increasing humility, not arrogance, because you become more aware of how little you actually know, how conditioned and limited your mental processes are, and how you are still subject to influences you cannot always fully perceive. But this genuine humility, paradoxically, can be perceived as arrogance by those who still operate from ego-defensive patterns. When someone can easily admit they were wrong about something, when they can change their mind without it threatening their identity, when they can see multiple sides of a complex issue without needing to pick a side. This can be perceived as a subtle form of superiority. The person who still depends on being right to maintain their self-esteem might interpret this mental flexibility as condescension, when in fact it represents a release from the ego defensive needs that make learning and growth so difficult. Harari also points to an emerging phenomenon he calls collective self-awareness, where groups of people who have developed individual metacognition begin forming communities and networks based not on shared beliefs or traditional group identities, but on a shared practice of questioning and self-examination. These communities may function in radically different ways from conventional social structures because their members are less susceptible to manipulation, more capable of navigating conflict without extreme polarization, and more willing to examine and revise their own assumptions when faced with contradictory evidence. This represents a potentially new form of social organization based not on conformity to external norms, but on a shared ability to question and examine any norm, including those developed by the group itself. This evolution may represent one of the most significant transformations in human history, comparable to the development of language, agriculture, or writing. Each of these innovations not only changed how humans lived, but fundamentally changed what it means to be human. The ability to consciously observe and question our own mental processes may represent the next evolutionary leap, not in a biological sense, but in terms of dramatically expanding what is possible within the parameters of the human condition. But, like all great transformations, this one is also encountering significant resistance, both from power structures that rely on the unconsciousness of others and from aspects of human psychology shaped by millions of years of evolution in very different contexts. The challenge for those developing this capacity is learning to navigate that resistance without becoming cynical or completely isolated. It is possible to maintain genuine connections with people who operate from very different patterns, as long as you understand that your role is not to convert anyone, but simply to live your own clarity as authentically and usefully as possible. Sometimes this means accepting that certain conversations are not possible, that some relationships have limitations, that a certain loneliness is the price of mental autonomy. Other times, it means finding creative ways to contribute to the well-being of others without directly challenging their defensive structures. One of the most liberating discoveries that comes with the development of metacognition is realizing that you are not responsible for the consciousness of others. You can share what you've learned. You can live in a way that serves as an example. You can create conditions that facilitate questioning and reflection, but you cannot force anyone to question patterns they are not yet ready to examine. This realization frees you both from the arrogance of thinking you have all the answers and from the frustration of trying to awaken people who are determined to stay asleep. Your responsibility is to develop and live your own clarity as well as you can, trusting that this alone contributes to the elevation of collective consciousness. The urgent question we face as a species is whether we will be able to develop this metacognitive capacity on a sufficient scale and with enough speed to navigate the challenges we are creating with our own technology. The next few decades will likely determine whether humanity evolves toward greater collective awareness or fragments even further between those who develop mental clarity and those who become increasingly imprisoned by automatic patterns, exploited by ever more sophisticated systems. The outcome of this tension will not only determine how we live, but who we become as a species. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the big questions that define our era, not just to seek understanding, but to discover wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with greater wisdom and purpose in a world that so often leaves us disoriented and divided. Perhaps metacognition, that rare capacity to observe our own minds in action, is exactly what our species needs to develop, not just to survive, but to thrive in the future we are creating. And perhaps those 1% who already possess this expanded consciousness are not a threat to be feared, but pioneers of a form of human existence that we can all eventually learn to embrace.
This extremely cynical view of humans is not true. Yes, humans are interested in power to some extent in some situations, but this is not the only thing that we want. We are not power-crazy demons. If you look at yourself, start with yourself. Mm-hmm. If I look at myself, do I want power in life? Yes, in some situations I want. This is not the only thing. I really want to know the truth about myself, my life, the world. And the key reason for that is that if you don't know the truth about yourself, you can never be happy. Because you don't know what are the sources of misery in your life, and you can't solve them. Once an entity has the capacity to suffer, it enters the ethical realm. It becomes an ethical subject. To burn a chair is not an ethical issue because the chair can't suffer. When you harm an animal, a sentient being, this is an ethical issue because it can suffer. And there are so many political discussions which revolve around that. For instance, the whole discussion of abortion. It's not the only issue, but a very central issue. Are fetuses conscious? Can they suffer or not? Are they ethical subjects in their own right or not? The same with animal rights. Can cows suffer? Can chickens suffer? Can fish suffer? And so forth. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they had the hijab laws, which says that every woman, when she goes out, walking or even driving in her private car, she must wear the hijab. And until today, the regime had difficulty enforcing the hijab laws because they didn't have, millions of police officers that you can place on every street. A police officer, if a woman drives without a headscarf, immediately she's arrested and fined or whatever. In the last few years, they switched to relying on an AI system. Iran is now crisscrossed by surveillance cameras with facial recognition software, which recognizes automatically if in the car that just passed by the camera, the facial recognition software can identify that this is a woman, not a man, and she's not wearing the hijab, and identify her identity, find her phone number, and within half a second, they send her an SMS message saying you broke the hijab law, your car is impounded. And it's not like there is a report that goes to the court and some human judge goes over the data and decides what to do. The AI immediately decides, okay, the car is confiscated.